I got a job as a radio operator in a small town in Montana. There are strange rules to follow. I've worked the late-night shift at the Blackridge radio station for the past 5 years. It's the only station in town, housed in a small, dusty building on the outskirts of nowhere. Our signal barely reaches beyond the pine-covered hills that enclose us. Most nights, the airwaves are still, sometimes unsettlingly so. Blackridge, Montana, is home to fewer than 300 residents, a place where everyone knows each other. The Blackridge General Store locks up at 9 p.m., and the Lone Bar serves beer in plastic cups. It's the kind of town where nothing ever happens. Until last night. At precisely 11:57 p.m., every emergency siren in town erupted at once. My radio console sparked to life, overriding all other signals. The station lights flickered, and then, through the heavy static, a voice emerged, a voice I had never encountered before. "Attention, Blackridge. This is an emergency alert. Please listen carefully." I sat up, heart hammering. The voice was flat, mechanical, pre-recorded. The signal was unnaturally strong, overpoweringly so. It was broadcasting across every frequency simultaneously. "For your safety, you must follow the instructions below until dawn." A sick unease coiled in my gut. This wasn't normal. This wasn't coming from any known official station. Then the directives began. Blackridge Emergency Directive. Rule 1. Do not look outside between midnight and sunrise. If there is knocking at your door, do not respond. It is not someone you know. Rule 2. Do not answer the phone if it rings. The voice will sound like a loved one. It is not them. Rule 3. Remain indoors. If you see someone outside after midnight, they are not from Blackridge. Secure all entrances. Rule 4. If your television turns on by itself, exit the room immediately. Do not look at the screen. Rule 5. If you hear footsteps inside your house, hide at once. Rule 6. Do not fall asleep. If you wake up and something feels off, it is already too late. Rule 7. By sunrise, only 7 will remain. Ensure you are one of them. The message looped. Then, silence. I stared at the console, pulse drumming in my ears. Outside, the siren ceased abruptly. And then, the power across town failed. The station plunged into complete darkness. For the first time in 5 years of uneventful nights, I realized I was not alone. The silence that followed was unnatural, pressing down like a weight, as if the entire town was collectively holding its breath. I reached for the backup generator switch beneath my console. It was old, finicky, but it had never failed me before. I yanked it hard. Nothing. No power. No broadcast. Just me, enveloped in the dark. The on-air sign flickered feebly, like a candle on the verge of dying. Then I saw it, beyond the front window. The street lights were dead, leaving the town swallowed in pitch black. That's when I noticed the movement. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, there were figures shifting between the buildings. Not walking. Floating. Rule 3. If you see someone outside after midnight, they are not from Blackridge. A cold weight settled in my chest. I backed away from the window. The radio console crackled, not the emergency message this time. Something different. A whisper. I leaned closer, heart thudding. The static was dense, distorted, like something was straining through the signal. Beneath it, I could just make out a voice. Not the robotic one from before. A woman. Familiar. Then my phone rang. I froze. The sharp sound sliced through the oppressive silence. Rule 2. Do not answer the phone. If it rings, it will sound like someone you love. It is not them. My fingers hovered over the receiver. Then the voice on the radio shifted. It spoke my name. Logan. The voice, I knew it. I snatched up the receiver, breath catching in my throat. Mom? Static. Then, faintly. Logan, let me in. My fingers went numb. My mother had been dead for 3 years. The radio screeched. Every dial on the console spun erratically. The overhead lights blinked back on for just an instant, enough time for me to see something outside the window. Tall. Featureless. Watching. Then, darkness again. The phone stopped ringing. The static cut off. For a long moment, I stood frozen, gripping the desk, my heartbeat a roar in my ears. Then, a knock at the door. Rule 1, do not look outside between midnight and sunrise. If you hear knocking at your door, ignore it. It is not someone you recognize. I stepped back. Another knock followed. Then, through the radio, my mother's voice returned. "Logan, please, just open the door." I didn't move. Didn't even breathe. The knocking ceased, but I knew whatever was out there hadn't left. It was simply waiting. I didn't sleep. I remained by the console for what felt like an eternity, listening to the steady hum of dead air, feeling the suffocating presence pressing against the station walls. My breath came shallow, my heartbeat still pounding from what I had heard, or whatever had attempted to sound like someone I once loved. The silence that followed wasn't reassuring. It was expectant, stretching over the town like a held breath, waiting for someone to falter. At 1:34 a.m., the emergency broadcast returned. Not the entire message, just a brief, static-laced warning. Rule violated. Then a pause. A low crackling sound in the background, reminiscent of distant movement. Then the voice spoke again. Subject, Tommy Grayson. A chill ran through me. Tommy was the bartender at the Rusty Stag, Blackridge's only bar, a man who had been serving drinks for as long as I could remember. Someone I knew. The message resumed. Violation, looked outside. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I lunged for the transceiver, my hands trembling as I switched to the town's emergency frequency. "Tommy, do you copy? Are you there?" Static. Then, screaming. Faint, distant, broken by interference. I pressed the headphones tighter, straining to make out the words. Not right, not a person, the eyes. Then, in a ragged, gasping whisper, "It saw me." A new sound emerged through the radio. Something unnatural. Not static. Not distortion. Something that mimicked a voice, but warped and wrong. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the transmission cut out. The alert voice returned. Subject, Tommy Grayson. Status, removed. The blood drained from my face. Removed. My first instinct was to turn to the window, but I stopped myself, clenching my eyes shut. I wouldn't make the same mistake. I didn't need to look outside to know Tommy Grayson was gone. Somewhere out there, he had broken a rule, and something had been waiting for him to do it. I gripped the edge of the desk, my palms damp, my breathing erratic. This was real. The rules weren't warnings. They were restrictions. A set of conditions in a game I didn't understand, played against something I couldn't see. And someone had already lost. By dawn, only 7 would remain. And I wasn't sure if I'd be one of them. The transmission ended, leaving me in a silence that felt denser than the air itself. I sat there, gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles ached, my pulse hammering in my ears. Tommy Grayson wasn't just hurt. He hadn't been taken to the hospital. He had been removed. As if he had never existed at all. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but the creeping dread was already coiling around my spine. The rules weren't mere suggestions. They were conditions for survival. I forced myself to check the time. 1:47 a.m. The night stretched on, and dawn was nowhere in sight. The atmosphere inside the station had changed, thicker, heavier, as though something unseen was watching, waiting for me to make a misstep. A gust of wind rattled the building. But I knew better. There was no wind tonight. With trembling fingers, I reached for the transceiver, switching to the emergency town frequency. "This is Logan at the Blackridge radio station. If anyone can hear this, respond immediately." Stay inside. Follow the rules. I released the button. Static. Then, after an extended pause, a voice. At first, I thought it belonged to someone familiar. The rhythm of speech was recognizable, but the words felt wrong. You should leave. My stomach twisted. Who is this? Silence. Then, a soft click. Like fingernails tapping against the microphone. Once. Twice. 3 times. A deep, instinctual dread warned me not to wait for the fourth. I killed the feed, exhaling sharply, rubbing a hand over my face. I had been a radio operator for 5 years. I knew the voices in this town. The cadences, the inflections of every regular caller. That voice, whoever it belonged to, was not from Blackridge. I needed to stay focused. I turned back to the monitoring system, a secondary screen hooked into the town's outdated emergency alert grid. Most of the feeds were dead. Without power, the surveillance network was virtually useless. But one still functioned, the traffic cam on Blackridge's Frontier Street. I leaned forward, breath catching. The grainy resolution flickered, struggling to hold an image, but it displayed just enough. At first, the street was deserted. Then, at the far end of the road, a figure materialized from the darkness, not walking, not running, just standing, as if it had always been there. Another appeared beside it. Then a third. They were unnaturally tall. Motionless. I stared, my hands frozen above the keyboard. Their heads twitched, and suddenly, as one, they turned toward the camera. Not like people. Not naturally. Their movements were abrupt, unnatural, like their bodies didn't fully comprehend how to move. And then, they started advancing. Toward the screen. I flinched instinctively, even though I knew they couldn't reach me. But something about the way they moved felt entirely wrong, not human. Not completely. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. The rules had warned against looking outside, but they hadn't said anything about watching through a camera. Had I just made a mistake? A sharp noise burst from the speakers, a high-pitched, ear-piercing wail like distorted radio feedback. But beneath it, something else. A voice. I lunged for the console, slamming the mute button, but the sound didn't stop. It bypassed the speakers completely, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. A whisper, inches from my ear. 3 are gone. The monitors glitched. For a fraction of a second, static filled the screen, and when it cleared, the street was empty once more. The figures had disappeared. I scrambled for my notepad, my breath coming in short bursts. 3, it had said. 3 were gone. Tommy was the first. Who were the other 2? I reached for the transceiver again, my fingers numb as I switched channels. If anyone is still listening, respond. If you're out there, say something. Silence. Then, a voice I didn't expect. Emily. The waitress from the diner. The last person I had spoken to before this nightmare began. She sounded breathless, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan, you're still here? Relief surged through me. Emily. Where are you? A pause. Then, hesitantly. I think I'm home. But... Then she made a small noise. A sharp inhale. A realization. Logan, I think I fell asleep. My stomach dropped. Rule 6, do not fall asleep. If you wake up and something feels different, it is too late for you. Emily, I said, gripping the desk tightly. When you woke up, did anything feel wrong? Silence. Then, in a voice softer than before. I don't remember falling asleep. It felt like I was drowning. Emily, listen carefully. Where exactly are you? A pause. Then, I don't think this is my house. A slow creak echoed through the speaker. A door opening. A long silence. Then she whispered, Logan. There's someone here with me. and the transmission cut off. I sat motionless, gripping the transceiver so tightly my fingers ached, my breath ragged. Emily was gone. Not dead. Just gone. The same way Tommy had vanished. The same way 2 others had disappeared without a trace. 3 were lost. 4 more to go. I pushed away from the desk, running a trembling hand over my face. My skin was damp with sweat despite the cold creeping through the station. I tried to focus, but something inside me was unraveling, as if my thoughts were fraying at the edges. I needed proof. I grabbed my notepad, flipping back to my list of Blackridge's residents. A habit from quiet nights, jotting down names, numbers, small details about the voices that called into the station. It wasn't an official town record, but it was something. 289 names. I scanned the list, searching for Tommy Grayson. His name wasn't there. My grip tightened around the pen. That was impossible. I had written it myself. I knew his number. I had just spoken to him last week about a lost wallet someone had turned in. I searched for Emily. Gone. I flipped through the pages, my breathing uneven. More names were missing. Entire sections of the town had simply disappeared. The ink hadn't faded. There were no scribbles or smudges. The pages were exactly as I had written them. But the names had never existed. I slammed the notebook shut, my chest tightening. The radio crackled. Not static. Movement. Like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I leaned toward the speaker, heart hammering, every part of me screaming that I didn't want to hear what came next. A breath. Slow. Labored. Too close to the mic. Then, a voice. Not mine. But almost. Logan. I recoiled so fast my chair nearly toppled. My own name, spoken in a voice that mimicked mine. It was wrong. Like an echo stretched too thin, distorted at the edges. Then, from beyond the station, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Drawing closer. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the desk, my heart pounding against my ribs. Something was outside. Rule 5, if you hear footsteps inside your house, hide immediately. I killed the radio. Powered down the monitors. Cut the console's supply. The room plunged into absolute silence. The footsteps halted right outside the door. I stared at the handle, my pulse roaring in my ears, nearly drowning out the sound of slow, measured breathing on the other side. It wasn't human. No person breathes like that. I pressed myself against the farthest wall, my gaze locked onto the door. I stayed motionless. I barely breathed. Then, gradually, the handle turned. No rattling. No frantic attempt to force entry. Just a slow, almost casual test, as though whoever, or whatever, was outside already knew the door was locked. The handle stilled. Then, knocking. And the voice. Logan. I clenched my jaw so tightly pain lanced through my temples. It sounded too close. I shut my eyes, pressing harder against the wall, as if I could disappear entirely. A long silence followed. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence vanished. I remained frozen until my legs cramped. But I wasn't foolish enough to believe it was gone for good. Just like before, it was waiting. With stiff movements, I forced myself up, edged toward the console, and flipped the power back on. I needed to know who was left. As soon as the radio hummed back to life, the emergency alert had already begun. Rule violated. A weight sank in my stomach. Subject, James Marston. James. The mechanic. A good man. A father of 3. Violation, answered the phone. A sharp burst of static cut through the speakers, almost like laughter. Subject, James Marston. Status, removed. I exhaled shakily, my fingers gripping the desk, my legs close to buckling. 4 gone. The town was unraveling before my eyes. Names were vanishing from my notebook. People weren't just dying, they were being erased. And the night was only halfway through. 3 more were marked. By dawn, only 7 would remain. And I had no idea how to ensure I was one of them. The clock on the console read 2:57 a.m. Time stretched thin, crawling forward like a needle dragging across an old film reel. But each time I blinked, it felt like minutes had disappeared. Maybe more. I checked the emergency alert log. 4 names lost. 4 who had broken the rules and were erased. Not dead. Not missing. Removed. As if they had never existed at all. The worst part? I couldn't even recall the last time I had spoken to them. Their faces blurred, their voices slipping away like echoes dissolving into static. I knew they had been here. I had to know. But I wasn't certain anymore. I dragged a hand through my hair, willing myself to focus. If I started doubting my own memory, I was already gone. Outside, the world was impossibly still. No engines. No voices. Not even the wind. It was as though Blackridge had become a hollowed-out space, a town that didn't even realize it had disappeared. I switched frequencies, trying every available channel. This is Logan at Blackridge Radio. If anyone can hear me, respond immediately. Silence. I tried again, my fingers numb. If anyone is still out there, I need you to respond. Don't tell me where you are. Just confirm you're still here. A long pause. Then, a voice. I'm here. I exhaled sharply, gripping the mic. Who is this? A hesitation. Then, I don't know. The voice was young. Male. But something about it twisted my stomach. Where are you? I asked carefully. Another silence. Then, quieter. I think. I'm in your station. The air in the room seemed to collapse inward. My throat tightened. The breath I drew and felt wrong, weighted, like I had inhaled something I shouldn't have. I turned slowly. The station was empty. The door remained locked. The windows shut. I was alone. Wasn't I? I turned back to the console. Stay where you are. I'm going to. The radio screamed. A surge of static exploded from the speakers, so loud it sent a sharp, stabbing pain through my skull. I ripped off the headset, ears ringing. The station trembled, the air vibrating like it had been stretched too thin. Then, the emergency alert crackled again. Rule violated. No. Not again. Subject, Megan Porter. Megan. The high school librarian. Always holding a book. Always smiling when she passed the station. Violation, watch the screen. My breath hitched. The screen. The television. Rule 4, if your television turns on by itself, leave the room immediately. Do not look at the screen. I shot to my feet, my body ice cold, my stomach hollow. The radio crackled again. Subject, Megan Porter. Status, removed. Another name erased. Another person who might slip from my memory by morning. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to concentrate. Megan had been Rule 5. That meant only 2 more had to vanish before the town stabilized, leaving 7 survivors. But what if I wasn't meant to be one of them? What if the list was predetermined? The thought nearly dropped me to my knees. The radio crackled again, but this time, it wasn't another alert. It was breathing. Right next to me. I spun so fast my vision blurred. Nothing. The station was still empty. The chair behind me untouched. The floorboards didn't creak. But I knew. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I snatched my keys, my bag, anything I could carry, and bolted for the door, wrenching it open into the suffocating dark. The town was eerily silent, and as I turned back to the radio station, the on-air sign was flickering. Flickering, as if something inside was breathing. I couldn't stay here. I had to find the others, if there were still others left. The air outside was dense, stifling, as though the whole town was holding its breath. The silence wasn't natural, it was deliberate, a vacuum of sound that made my own breathing feel deafening. I gripped my flashlight tightly, sweeping it across the empty streets. The streetlights were lifeless, their bulbs shattered or swallowed by the darkness. The neon sign of Millie's Diner, the one that always hummed faintly, even when switched off, was missing. Not broken. Gone. The town wasn't just losing people. It was losing pieces of itself. I had one objective: find anyone still alive. I moved swiftly, my boots crunching against the cracked asphalt as I crossed the street. With each step, the air seemed to thicken, the houses on Frontier Street appearing distorted, their windows too hollow, too empty. I reached the first door and knocked forcefully. No response. I tried the next house. Still nothing. My pulse pounded. There had to be someone left. Then, from ahead, a sound. Shuffling. Uneven footsteps. I froze, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, heart hammering. Then, I saw her. A figure emerging from the shadows, staggering toward me from the far end of the street. A rush of relief surged through me. "Emily!" I called, stepping forward. Then, she stopped. Too fast. Too unnatural. The way her body halted wasn't how a person stops walking. It was as if an invisible string had been cut. The flashlight flickered. I took a careful step back. She moved again, not in my direction, but in the wrong way. 1 second, she was 5 feet away. Then 2. Then, directly in front of me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. My stomach churned violently. The distance between us hadn't closed naturally, she had just appeared closer. Instantly. I stared, my breath shallow. Emily? Her face wasn't right. Her features were familiar, but they no longer belonged to her. Her eyes were vacant, lips slightly parted. And when she tilted her head, it felt like she was waiting. Waiting for me to make a mistake. Rule 7. By dawn, there will be 7 survivors. Make sure you are one of them. She took another step forward, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the pavement. I turned and ran. I didn't think. Didn't hesitate. I just sprinted down the street, my breath ragged, my flashlight bouncing wildly over the cracked asphalt. Behind me, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard nothing. And that was worse. The town distorted as I ran, houses shifting at the edges of my vision, doors vanishing from buildings where they should have been. The roads twisted, warping beneath my feet. I reached Blackridge General Store, slamming into the glass doors and yanking the handle. Locked. Inside, through the dusty window, I saw movement, a shadow crouched behind the counter. I banged on the glass. "Let me in." For a horrifying moment, I thought they wouldn't. Then, the click of a lock. The door swung open, and I all but stumbled inside, chest heaving. The man inside was shaking. His face pale, eyes hollow with exhaustion. It took me a moment to recognize him. Kyle Mercer. Night shift at Blackridge General Store. A guy I had spoken to 100 times, always complaining about the cold. But tonight, his expression was different. He looked at me like he wasn't sure I was real. "You're still here," he murmured. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "How many of us remain?" His gaze flickered toward the windows. I'm not sure. I think we're close to 7. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Close to 7. That meant 1 or 2 more had to vanish before it was over. Kyle wiped a trembling hand over his face. "Did you see them? The ones that aren't real?" I thought of Emily, the unnatural way she moved, how she had stopped so suddenly. I nodded. Kyle exhaled sharply. "I think they're replacing people." "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, lowering his voice. "I saw my brother outside earlier." I frowned. "Your brother lives in Denver." "I know," Kyle whispered. But he knocked on the door. He called my name. And he sounded like him. Almost. The overhead lights flickered. Outside, the darkness felt heavier, pressing against the glass as if it wanted in. "Kyle," I said carefully. "Did you let him in?" His breath hitched. His hands trembled. His lips parted slightly, and realization hit me like ice water. I couldn't remember if Kyle had been on my list. I couldn't recall if he was one of the missing. And if I couldn't remember, had he already been replaced? The store hummed with the low buzz of failing fluorescence. The old coolers against the back wall let out a slow, labored drone, struggling to keep running. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, shifting slightly, watching. Kyle stood near the counter, hands unsteady, staring at me with an exhaustion that ran deeper than lack of sleep. His breathing was uneven, like someone trying too hard to appear normal. I kept my own breath steady, my fingers inching toward the flashlight in my pocket. He still hadn't answered my question. "Kyle," I said again, softer this time. "Did you let your brother in?" His throat bobbed. The silence stretched. Then finally, he shook his head. But something about the way he did it was wrong, hesitant, delayed, as if forcing himself to say no. A chill crawled up my spine. Something about Kyle wasn't right. The emergency alert had said only 7 would make it. That meant 2 more still had to be removed. And if I wasn't one of them, Kyle might be. He looked down, rubbing his palms against his jeans. I haven't heard the alerts in a while," he mumbled. Maybe we made it through." I didn't answer. Because the emergency alerts hadn't stopped. I just wasn't sure if Kyle could hear them anymore. The ding of the store's automatic doors made my breath hitch. A figure stepped inside. I nearly backed up, hands balling into fists, but when I saw who it was, I felt something colder than fear. Sheriff Whitaker. He stood just inside the doorway, his eyes sweeping the dimly lit store, his breathing slow and steady. His uniform was neat, completely unruffled. Too clean for someone who had been fighting to survive the night. The last time I had seen him was before the emergency alerts began. Before everything fell apart. Kyle exhaled sharply. "Jesus, Sheriff, where the hell have you been?" The sheriff's gaze settled on Kyle. His lips curled into a faint, reassuring smile. "Keeping order." My stomach twisted. He looked real. His movements, his tone, everything about him seemed natural. But so had Emily. And so had Kyle. Sheriff Whitaker stepped further into the store. His boots didn't make a sound against the tile. Not even the faintest scuff. His eyes met mine. "You're the radio operator," he said smoothly. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. The sheriff's smile widened. "You've done well to last this long." The air inside the store shifted, a weight settling over my shoulders, pressing down on me, as though something unseen had entered the room. The fluorescence above buzzed louder, flickering erratically. Kyle stiffened beside me, something unreadable in his posture. But he didn't move. The sheriff stepped closer. "Sunrise is near," he murmured. "Not much longer now." His voice was so normal, so perfectly human, that for one fleeting second, I almost believed him. Then, his head tilted just slightly. Like he was waiting for me to slip up. I swallowed hard. The final rule of the emergency alert rang through my head. By dawn, there will be 7 survivors. Make sure you are one of them. The unspoken warning was clear now. Not everyone who sees sunrise is real. I took a slow step backward. "What happened to the others?" I asked, keeping my voice measured. The sheriff studied me. Then he smiled. "They didn't belong." Behind me, Kyle inhaled sharply. The lights flickered again. And the emergency alert crackled to life. Rule breached. The sheriff's smile remained unchanged. Subject, Kyle Mercer. I turned toward Kyle. His face had drained of all color. "No," he murmured. "No, I followed the rules. I swear. Infraction replaced. A chill raced down my spine. Kyle turned to me, desperation contorting his features. Logan. The radio interrupted him. Subject, Kyle Mercer. Status, removed. Kyle's eyes widened. And then, without a sound, without resistance, he was gone. As if he had never existed at all. The pressure in the air eased slightly. The flickering fluorescent lights steadied. Sheriff Whitaker stood motionless, still smiling. Looks like we have our final 7, he said softly. I felt nauseous. Cold. 7 survivors. Me, the sheriff, and 5 others, if they even were human. I stepped backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. What are you? The sheriff's grin widened a fraction. Dawn is near, he said instead. You should feel honored. The world beyond the glass lightened, not with the warm hues of sunrise, but something different. A pale, grayish glow crawling over the horizon. Too quick. Too unnatural. The rules never mentioned what would happen after sunrise. Only that we had to endure until then. The sheriff watched me, and a terrible realization settled in my chest. The rules weren't meant to keep them out. They were meant to choose who stayed. And now, I was among them. The first light of daybreak crested the horizon, yet it was wrong. Cold. Colorless, like sunlight diffused through deep water. The darkness smothering Blackridge didn't dissipate. It withdrew, coiling back into the void it came from, curling at the edges of existence. By 6 a.m., the emergency broadcast had ceased. The rules were no longer in effect. And the town was different. I stood at the store's glass doors, breath shallow, peering out at Blackridge. The streets lay empty. No cars. No movement. No birds, no distant hum of engines from the highway. Just silence. I forced myself outside. The air was crisp, the sky a washed-out shade of blue. Yet the town didn't feel real. I walked down Frontier Street. The buildings remained standing, but something was off. The colors muted, the edges both too sharp and too blurred, as if reality itself was struggling to hold its shape. And then I saw them. The others. 7 of us. Just as the emergency alert had dictated. A woman stood frozen outside Millie's diner, staring into the window as if she didn't recognize her own reflection. An older man leaned against his truck near Town Hall, gripping the door handle so tightly his knuckles turned white, like he feared letting go. Sheriff Whitaker stood across the street, watching me. His uniform was spotless. His expression composed. Too composed. I tore my gaze away. We weren't the same town anymore. I wasn't even sure we were the same people. Digging into my pocket, I gripped my notepad with cold fingers. I flipped through its pages, heart hammering, searching for the names I had written the night before. Tommy Grayson, gone. Megan Porter, gone. Kyle Mercer, gone. Emily Carter, gone. And then, I realized something else. I had stopped recording names after the 5th disappearance. I didn't know if the other 3 had ever existed at all. Whenever I tried to remember them, my thoughts crumbled into static. Logan. I turned slowly. Sheriff Whitaker had moved closer, hands tucked into his pockets, his face unreadable. He glanced at the horizon, where the sun had fully risen, yet its warmth never touched the ground. It felt sterile. Artificial. We made it, he said simply. I didn't reply. Because I wasn't sure if that was a victory. His gaze drifted toward my notepad. Writing it down won't help, he murmured. By tomorrow, you won't need it. I swallowed, my throat tight. Why? His smile remained, but his eyes held nothing. Because soon, you won't remember anything else. The words weighed on me like a stone, sinking deep into my chest. I glanced toward the others. None of them spoke. None of them moved. They just stood there, staring into nothing. Something had shifted. The town let us survive, but what had we lost in return? I stepped back. What happens now? Whitaker exhaled, a sound that could have been laughter. Now, he said, we move on. I shook my head. No. This isn't right. Something happened last night. Something real. And we need to. He took a step forward. Logan. I fell silent. His expression was too calm. Too still. He tilted his head slightly, and I realized I was the only one still asking questions. The others just stood. Waiting. Accepting. Dear friends, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. I dream of 1,000 subscribers very much. My pulse skyrocketed. Whatever had happened last night, the ones who disappeared weren't the only ones who changed. The 7 of us survived. But that didn't mean we were human anymore. I stepped back, my throat dry. I have to leave. Whitaker's smile never wavered. The air felt too heavy. The town stretched endlessly in all directions, unchanged, familiar. But I knew the truth. There was nowhere else to go. Blackridge had let us survive. But it had kept us, too. Friends, write your impressions of the story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and like us to get more content like this.